This is the Abhaya Mudra, the mudra of no fear, of peace. And the obvious question is, what might we be afraid of? And obviously the classic Buddhist answer is suffering. Life contains so much suffering. And so the Abhaya Mudra is the promise of freedom from suffering. And in the context of tonight's talk, I much want to call it freedom from suffering rather than the end of suffering, because I think maybe that's something slightly different. If we follow the Theravadan idea that they represent as close as we have to the original school of Buddhism, the teaching of Shakyamuni, it's quite clear that in the discourses that the Buddha speaks within the Theravada canon, that there is only really one version of freedom in this sense, and that's the nirvana, that is extinction, the end of rebirth, the end of desire, the end. And so in that sense, the promise of freedom from fear is literally extinction. That's not where we are, and that's not how we practice. The point of our practice is life as it is, this life. Messy, complicated, a life of desire, a life of, in that sense, suffering, and how best to live that life. We've just been chanting our version of the Four Great Vows, and in that we've used the line free all sentient beings rather than save all sentient beings, which is the way that it also often gets translated. Again, to talk about freeing all beings is, well, it's a big enough question, isn't it? What might the difference between freeing and saving be in that sense? Freedom from suffering. Freedom is an incredibly important idea. It's an incredibly important practice within our Western tradition. The two great founding revolutions of modern Western culture, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, were both absolutely fought in the name of freedom or liberty. And the question is then, of course, whose freedom to do what? One of the classic treatments of freedom is actually in Isaiah Berlin's book, Liberty. He draws a very, very useful distinction between freedom from and freedom to. Often we just think of freedom in terms of freedom from. Just think that through a little. Following on from the thought of the American Revolution, we have in 3 weeks' time, I think, the holiday commemoration of Juneteenth, the final liberation of slaves in the American South after the Civil War. Freedom from slavery is obviously a fairly crucial case of freedom from, and we might think, following on through George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, freedom not to be beaten or killed by the police is a pretty important kind of freedom. Again, negative freedom. So what freedom to be, and how would this differ? Well, another interesting writer on freedom, Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, fairly mainstream figure, his book, Development as Freedom, he's talking about freedom as the development of capability. And he's talking about development in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the rest of the world, in terms of it shouldn't fundamentally be about economics. It should be about the development, the freedom to develop capability of individuals, of societies. That's a very different sense of freedom, isn't it? What's preventing this? Well, obviously, all kinds of things. Access to food, access to healthcare, access to education. Now again, we can think of those in terms of freedom from hunger, freedom from disease, freedom from ignorance. And the two ideas kind of always interrelate. But really, the question is always, how does this come back to me? What am I thinking in terms of freedom? The freedoms which I enjoy and the freedoms which I lack. What would I like freedom to do? What's on my back? What do I really need freedom from? Freedom from and freedom to. Let's think of another example. We could say the freedom to be able to, be allowed to feel safe walking in public space. It's a pretty important freedom. If you're in Palestine or Sudan at the moment, if you're in Afghanistan and you happen to be a woman, actually if you're in the West and you happen to be a woman and it's late at night and you're on your own in a space that maybe you do and maybe you don't know, maybe that's a freedom that you'd like to feel, that you had actually truly the sense of freedom to walk in that public space. And not to feel free to do those things is a very real restriction. And it's a restriction, and this is where it gets interesting, partly placed on me by society, and partly a restriction I place upon myself. And to some extent, I'm probably involved in placing that kind of restriction on, or a different kind of restriction, on other people as well. This self-policing, policing of others, being policed by others. In one sense, this is just the rules of our society, but clearly, this is often not so good. This is something I've talked about in terms of our practice, in terms of walls of our mind. And we have this phrase, walls of our mind, in several translations of the Heart Sutra. The invisible walls that keep us thinking in one direction and not seeing the other possibilities. Sometimes not seeing and not going there. Sometimes not even being aware that I'm not seeing. Looking straight through. Completely unaware. these are the walls that channel, control, constrain our sense of capability and possibility. Strangely in this way, because everything's connected, and the point of this talk, like every other talk, is really just everything's connected, everything not separate. To free ourselves is to free all beings, in the sense of the four great vows. To free all beings, to contribute to freeing all beings, is the same as to free ourselves. Let's think of that in a classically Buddhist context here. The four Brahma Viharas, the divine abidings, or whatever we want to translate them as. Metta, Maitri, Karuna, Mudita. How shall we translate these? Friendliness, caring, sympathetic joy. These are all fundamentally relationship. They're all fundamentally to do with relationship. Friendliness, often translated as loving kindness. Do we need to love in that sense? Is kindness a bit overgeneral? It doesn't really matter. Friendliness is quite a nice translation. Feeling well disposed, feeling open, feeling positive, recognizing, in a word that we often use in these talks, recognizing the other as other, and being happy that they're there. Not feeling this gulf of separation, this sense of, well, it's either them or me. Karuna, often translated as compassion. We're preferring to use care, taking it away from a nice fuzzy feeling towards an intention towards action. Fundamentally about relationship. What is your need? What is my need? How do we address that? How do we come together? And again, in the spirit of the Brahma Viharas, in the spirit of the Heart Sutra, in the spirit of our practice. Not as separate, but as sharing, as together. Not as carer and cared for in the strong sense, but as equals, partners, recognizing each other. Mudita, sympathetic joy. Simply being happy, joyful that the other is joyful. Again, not seeing their happiness as of no concern to me, not seeing their happiness as a threat to me, seeing their happiness as something to be happy about, their joy as engendering joy in me. Now it's easy to just think of these, and it's perfectly true, as on the axis of self or no self, or on the axis of being a closed self and being completely open to the world. But in that sense, that's one particular, very strong, very important example of these kind of walls of the mind. This fantasy, this delusion that you and I are entirely separate. And what are these Brahmavihara practices? They're simple, pragmatic ways to try and weaken this particular wall, this sense of separation between self and other. And I think this gives us quite a nice rule of thumb, and it's often complicated, it's often muddled, and few things are ever entirely one thing or another. But to see where the very idea of freedom can be used as a weapon against the very idea of freedom. So if my idea of freedom is to have the right to insult you, if my idea of freedom is to have the right to control you, or hold you responsible, or blame you, and the right to express that with force, that seems to me to be taking us in the direction of separation, in the direction of building walls, rather than freeing ourselves of these walls of the mind. And in fact, you could see all forms of othering, which we've talked about at length at one point or another, as breaking down these relationships of friendliness, of care, of sympathetic joy, because we're different, we're separate. Beautiful example, and forgive my ignorance, I only came across, was told about the other day. And I mentioned Juneteenth because it's coming up in a few weeks' time. During the Jim Crow years in the South, in many, many places, black children could not eat vanilla ice cream. They were obliged to eat chocolate ice cream. So if you have a darker colour skin, no matter how marginally, you eat dark ice cream. And if you have pure white skin, then you eat vanilla ice cream. And the way that this perfectly encapsulates, in one sense, a kind of remarkably trivial level, how unimportant compared with the big things which are going on. In that sense, yeah, absolutely. And yet what a perfect way of telling children that they are separate, they are different, that there are these walls between us, and that we need to respect these walls. Now, this wasn't a law, it wasn't any kind of statute or ordinance, it was just understood by almost everybody, almost all the time. An invisible wall, an unquantifiable wall, but a wall that says you're not free, your possibilities are limited. So I think we can come back to the Abhaya Mudra and begin to think a little about the relationship between freedom and fear. What are we afraid of? Well, in that sense, we're afraid of relationship and the absence of relationship. Let's think this through a little. The big scale, we have a properly social world. People we don't know, people we know about, people we maybe just pass. Then we have the level of our really intimate relationships. The people who we really need to recognise and who really need to recognise us, see each other, feel each other as equals. And then we have our relationships within ourselves, between our manifold different selves, between the parts of us which we like, the parts of us which we don't like, the parts of us we're aware of, the parts of us which other people maybe see and we just don't see, and all their relationships, and our relationship with our own vulnerability, our own mortality, our own incapacity, just being actual, real, embodied beings. And then we have our relationship with this moment, not as something flying around that maybe if I could just catch it, hold it, but just as whatever this, whatever this, happy this, sad this, bored this, worried about something this, separate and not separate. And the fear is born of the sense of separation. In many ways, at many levels, obviously. But the promise of the Abhaya Mudra is to begin to address this sense of separation. Separation from each other, separation within myself, separation along the walls of my mind, and separation from being this moment, from simply resting in this moment, whatever it is, joyful, miserable, completely unremarkable. Not as being just simply one, but being aware and resting within this space that is my life. And this is the sense of freedom which our practice offers us. But not as an end. Not as, oh, well, that's okay then. But as the position from which we can move out to others, relate to others, care for others, care with others, be cared for by others, and love and live. Freedom as relationship with the other, within myself, with this moment. I think that's a freedom worth being, worth having. So we'll sit and then we'll have a share.